The most disturbing news came when body parts of the dismembered victim were found across the road of Cavare's home.
In the shadowy underbelly of Adelaide, Australia, a gruesome tale of horror unfolded.
The first thing they said to me was, boss, we've got bodies.
It blew into the single biggest case in South Australian history. And if it does, I don't want to see it. Not in my lifetime.
A tale that would forever stain the history of this seemingly peaceful land. This is the story of the Snowtown Murders, one of Australia's most notorious cases of serial killings, where a group of men believed themselves to be judge, jury, and executioner. Our story begins on September 4th, 1966, with the birth of John Bunting in Inala, Queensland. Bunting's childhood was far from idyllic. Raised in an abusive household, he was subjected to physical and emotional trauma that would later fuel his intense hatred towards certain groups of people. According to reports, Bunting may have suffered sexual abuse, which contributed to his deep-seated animosity towards homosexuals and pedophiles. By the age of 18, Bunting had moved to Adelaide and taken up work in a crematorium, followed by a job at an abattoir. His early exposure to death and violence perhaps set the stage for his future atrocities. It was in Adelaide that he married Christine Harvey and became a stepfather to her son, James Vlasakis. In the early 1990s, Bunting, now settled in Adelaide's suburb of Salisbury North, began to gather a group of like-minded individuals. Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden were among his closest associates. Together, they formed a lethal bond, driven by Bunting's twisted sense of justice and his insatiable need for control. Their first known victim was Clinton Trezise, a 22-year-old man Bunting suspected of being a pedophile. On August 31st, 1992, Bunting lured Trezise to his home under the guise of a friendly chat.
Nobody of great note, not many friends.
What followed was a brutal accusation and an even more brutal murder. Trezise's body was discovered 3 years later in a shallow grave, but by then, Bunting had already moved on to more victims. The next known victim was Ray Davies, a man with intellectual disabilities who lived nearby. In December 1995, Bunting and Wagner kidnapped Davies, subjected him to horrific torture, and ultimately killed him. They even sold Davies' trailer and cashed his Social Security checks. In 1997, they turned their attention to Michael Gardner, a young homosexual man. Bunting's hatred for homosexuals drove him to target Gardner, who was living with Robert Wagner's cousin. On September 9, 1997, Bunting and Wagner took Gardner to a remote location, tortured him, and eventually killed him. His body was later found in a barrel. Their cruelty knew no bounds. In October 1997, they killed Vanessa Lane, a transgender woman and former partner of Robert Wagner. Fearing that she might reveal their secrets to the authorities, they tortured and killed her, placing her body in another barrel. James Vlasakis, Bunting's stepson, became deeply involved in the horrific activities of the group. Influenced by Bunting's dominance and charisma, James participated in the murders, despite his initial reluctance. He witnessed the brutality firsthand and was eventually coerced into taking part. In November 1998, the group moved their operations to an abandoned bank building in Snowtown, a small town north of Adelaide. This location became their gruesome headquarters, where they stored the barrels containing the remains of their victims. Among the many victims were Gavin Porter, a drug addict who had introduced Vlasakis to heroin, and Troy Yude, Vlasakis' stepbrother, who had allegedly abused him as a child. In late 1998, Bunting and Wagner killed Porter, placing his body in a barrel. In August of the same year, they tortured and killed Yude, subjecting him to unimaginable cruelty before disposing of his body. In November 1998, Elizabeth Hayden, Mark Hayden's wife, became another victim. Bunting, Wagner, and Vlasakis feared she might expose their crimes. They kidnapped, tortured, and killed her, storing her body in one of their infamous barrels. Their final known victim was David Johnson, Vlasakis' half-brother, who was lured to Snowtown and killed in May 1999.
By now, we were concerned that Elizabeth had met with foul play.
This murder, like the others, was brutal and merciless. The gruesome collection of barrels in the abandoned bank building became a macabre symbol of their reign of terror. The bodies of their victims were often dismembered and stored in these barrels, a chilling testament to their brutality. The heinous acts of the Snowtown murderers continued until May 1999, when police, following a trail of missing persons reports and suspicious financial activities, raided the bank building in Snowtown. What they found inside was a scene out of a nightmare. Barrels filled with decomposing human remains.
Those 6 barrels contained the remains of 8 people.
That was the first time that we realised that this was the evidence that we'd been seeking.
The arrest of John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlasakis marked the beginning of one of the longest and most expensive trials in South Australian history. The courtroom was a battleground, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence and harrowing testimonies. The details that emerged were horrifying, shedding light on the depths of human cruelty. John Bunting, the ringleader, was sentenced to 11 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Robert Wagner received 10 life sentences, also without the possibility of parole. James Vlasakis, for his cooperation with the police, was sentenced to 4 life terms with the possibility of parole after 26 years. Mark Hayden, who helped store the bodies, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Experts and law enforcement officials reflected on the case, highlighting the psychological manipulation Bunting exerted over his associates. They described him as a master manipulator, capable of bending others to his will and orchestrating a series of brutal murders without remorse. Bunting's control over his group was absolute. He preyed on their vulnerabilities and used fear and intimidation to keep them in line. His ability to manipulate others was chilling.
This is certainly one of the most complex, tragic and quite horrific matters that we've had to deal with. As far as a serial crime, this was the largest that we've had in Australia.
The meticulous work required to identify the remains and piece together the evidence was grueling. It was a constant reminder of the human lives that were lost in such a senseless and brutal manner. The Snowtown murders left a lasting scar on the community of Adelaide and the broader Australian society. The case prompted significant changes in the criminal justice system, including improved tracking of missing persons and better support for victims of abuse. It also sparked a national conversation about the importance of mental health and the need to address the root causes of such extreme violence.
The biggest serial murder investigation in Australia's modern history.
In the history of South Australia, has the challenge been so great?
The Snowtown case was a wake-up call for many of us in the field. It underscored the importance of vigilance and the need for continuous improvement in our methods and approaches to solving complex cases. The Snowtown murders have been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and even a feature film titled Snowtown, released in 2011. These portrayals have brought the story to a wider audience, ensuring that the victims are not forgotten and that the brutal reality of the crimes is not glossed over. While these portrayals have helped to keep the memory of the victims alive, they also serve as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil within human nature. The challenge remains to balance the need for remembrance with the pursuit of understanding and preventing such horrors in the future. As we look to the future, questions remain about the potential parole of James Vlasakis, who may become eligible for release in 2025. This possibility raises complex ethical and legal considerations. As the community grapples with the prospect of one of the Snowtown murderers being reintegrated into society, the potential parole of Vlasakis is a contentious issue. While he cooperated with law enforcement and his testimony was crucial in securing convictions, the nature of his crimes and his involvement in such heinous acts cannot be ignored. The decision will undoubtedly weigh heavily on the community and the judicial system. The psychological toll on those involved in the investigation was immense. Detectives and forensic experts who worked on the case have spoken about the lasting impact of their work and the haunting images that remain with them to this day. It's something you never forget. The sights, the smells, the sheer brutality of what we discovered, it stays with you. But we knew we had to see it through, to bring justice for the victims and their families. The meticulous work required to identify the remains and piece together the evidence was grueling. It was a constant reminder of the human lives that were lost in such a senseless and brutal manner. For the families of the victims, the road to healing has been long and arduous. The brutal nature of the murders and the loss of their loved ones have left deep emotional scars. Community support and counseling have played crucial roles in helping them cope with the trauma and grief. There are no words to describe the pain of losing a loved one in such a horrific way. It's something that stays with you every day. But the support from the community and the efforts to remember the victims have been a source of strength. In an effort to honor the victims and ensure that their memories are preserved, several memorials and dedications have been established. These serve as places for reflection and a reminder of the importance of justice and compassion. In 2012, the infamous bank building in Snowtown was demolished, a symbolic act aimed at erasing the physical remnants of the horror that had transpired there. However, the stories of the victims and the lessons learned from this dark chapter in history continue to resonate. The Snowtown Murders serve as a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity and the devastating consequences of unchecked hatred and violence. It's a story that will haunt the annals of true crime history forever, as we remember the victims and reflect on the lessons learned. We must also strive to build a society where such atrocities can never occur again. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true crime stories. Together, we can remember the past and work towards a better future.